Well, welcome everybody. We've spent the entire day talking about tipping points and tripwires. It's interesting that in every conversation, China has been either part of the conversation, a focus of the conversation, and a critical concern, I think, for the entire forum. We'll have an opportunity now to talk directly about China and its place in the world as they see themselves, their place in the world as we see them, and how the rest of the world sees and works with in this multipolar and chaotic global security environment. So, Lieutenant General Robling, guts. It'll be it will be. We've worked together a long time, and so if I slip, excuse me. I'll start with you, and just really, rather than jumping right into the questions, do you want to give an overview from your perspective?
Sure. I think maybe a scene setter would be good for China, and I know most of you get it, that it's a long ways away. In the combatant command, so the PACOM command that's responsible for that AOR, it's half the globe. It's half the world's globe that covers that area. We talk about it being, complex, and it is for a reason. I mean, it's 6,000 miles from Washington to Hawaii. It's 4,000 miles from Hawaii to Guam. It's another 2,500 miles to the mainland, and then, give or take some miles to a lot of our allies out there. We have 6 treaties with countries in Asia, 6 treaties. And of course, we have the Taiwan Relations Act as well. And then we have other things like Five Eyes, where a couple of countries are included. We have the AUKUS, what we talked about earlier, providing submarines, nuclear submarines to the Australians. So it's a complex AOR that makes the job with China or the mission with China in every domain. And we just talked about a big one there in space. And I think, and in fact, Lieutenant General Whitney opened it up with what happens if the 2 major powers of the world go at it. And we just heard from the Senior Master Chief what's going to happen. It really, it takes out a lot of the world. A lot of economies will go under. It's an expensive fight. It's a long fight for us to get to. If you talk to the PACOM combatant commander, he'll tell you that the U.S. Navy can muster 300 ships. Right now, the Chinese Navy can muster 350 ships. They have 22 shipyards, I believe that's right, around 22 shipyards. They have 200 times the capability to build ships than we do. They are active in space, as we just heard. They are an oppressive society that keeps down any friction within anywhere from farmers to civil society. So it takes all of the PACOM commander's resources, which includes every service and in every domain, including space and under the sea.
Thanks, Gus. Appreciate it very much. Becca, I would really appreciate your insights as well.
Yeah, first and foremost, thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I am so sorry that I can't be there in person, but hopefully me on a screen will have to do in some form. I know I won't get from it everything that I would if I were in person. So again, really appreciate it. So, I think General Robling just gave us a great overview, and I was really struck with the theme of the conference overall, sort of talking about tripwires and tipping points. And as a wargamer, most of what I do is out of unclassified war games. I'm often thinking about the future, and I'm often thinking about alternate scenarios. And a lot of the games that I do are very conflict-based. So I'm trying to think of different ways in which the United States could find itself at a potential tipping point into conflict with China. And so here, I think when I'm really trying to grapple with tipping points, there's a lot of different ones that I think we don't necessarily always talk about. in sort of the public for. There are numerous tipping points. There's different scenarios and geographies. There's different areas of focus, right? It's not just on perhaps maybe this military competition, but also competition for resources, including semiconductors. So to me, there's almost this big rhetorical question of what is a tipping point and what could be a tipping point here. Is Taiwan a potential tipping point? It could be. But at the same time, are we so laser focused on a potential Taiwan invasion scenario that we aren't considering, other ways that scenario could unfold? That there are lesser forms of aggression, like a sustained blockade of Taiwan, that could also be a major tipping point into conflict. Are there other ways that China's gray zone activities and tactics, including its use of economic coercion over TSMC and Taiwan's semiconductor industry, could that spark a crisis and spill over into conflict? Are these other forms of tipping points that we don't always think about? And then conversely, are we so focused on Taiwan that we're not thinking about some other, perhaps maybe even more near-term pressing tipping points, such as China's claim to features in the East and South China Sea, its border skirmishes with India, perhaps even its burgeoning ability to project and sustain power into the Indian Ocean. These are just but some examples of some alternate scenarios and alternate tipping points that I don't think that we always tend to think about. But regardless of whether these actually become reality or not, right? I'm just positing a bunch of potential futures that could or could not come to fruition. I do think that we are on the precipice of a tipping point right now. And that tipping point is whether the United States sustains the ability to deter China from aggression, to be able to convince Beijing that any action they could take that undergirds international norms would not be successful or profitable. Right now, the United States is at a point where it needs to make decisions to ensure that we can deter China, both presently and in the future. And some of this is because of China's own efforts, right? I'm sure you've heard numerous times today about how it's embarked on an ambitious military modernization effort, how it's trying to overcome some of its potential shortfalls in personnel and skills, and that it's rapidly building up its stockpiles of nuclear weapons despite having a stated policy of no first use. It's also because of where the United States currently is in our own military modernization process. Much of what we would need to do to strengthen both conventional and nuclear deterrence is going to take time to come to fruition. It's capabilities that are going to take time to come online. It's posture changes that are going to take quite some time to start pouring concrete where we might need to actually build infrastructure and outposts. It's going to take a lot of time to bolster the resiliency of the U.S. industrial base so we can produce enough munitions to sustain the United States in a potential military conflict with China, which is looking more and more likely that it would become a protracted conflict. So this means that right now, to me, the biggest tipping point that we need to consider is where the United States is and how it is we can bolster deterrence, because time is of the essence here, and it's a tipping point between whether the United States is going to maintain its ability to deter China into the future.
Thank you, Becca. Appreciate that very much. There are a couple of things, and I know I wasn't on the prep session, so I won't surprise you with questions. But there are two areas that have come up earlier in the day, and it's how do we bolster deterrence, especially when we look at China and its efforts in multi-domains and across all instruments of what we would consider national power. So thank you very, very much. Dr. Holmes, welcome.
Hi, Hi, folks. And speaking of calling an audible, I did that just yesterday. I was actually planning on riding out to Hartford to be with you all in person, but my daughter's wedding down in Maryland is a week from tomorrow, and a COVID case or two have popped up in the family, and we sort of got cold feet and decided to more or less do a 2020 rerun and sequester until we head down. So, but I thank you to the organizers for making these provisions for me to do it remotely. Done a number of events with the World Affairs Council, and they're always first rate. Now, when I looked at the topic of the panel, I sort of started off, and I'm a bear of little brains, so I went out and started looking at dictionary definitions and trying to figure out what a tipping point is. And there were some common denominators among them. All definitions involve change. They're all about cause and effect. They're all about time, namely the time that's when some cause tips over into some effect, and you have a change of state. But my favorite definition, and the one that really speaks to me the most personally, comes from Malcolm Gladwell in his book by the same name about 10 or 15 years ago. And I like it because he likens the tipping point to a boiling point. And again, I like this definition for two reasons. First of all, it very effectively conveys the image of a phase change from one state to another, just as we make steam in engineering plants, much as Admiral Richardson and I used to do, in order to drive turbines and do work. But to me, even more appealing than that visual imagery is that it brings in the human factor. The idea of a boiling point stresses that we determine the rate and intensity at which we add thermal energy to a system in order to make steam and do work. We can turn down the heat if we wanted to in order to postpone or even cancel the process of boiling. Even after the boiling point, we can always turn down the heat, cool down the steam, and condense it in order to recover the water for future use. We do it every single day to improve our efficiency. Bottom line, tipping points are neither inevitable nor irreversible, the way many dictionary definitions tend to imply. Now, for something completely different, let me shift gears and talk about a tipping point in a time not unlike our own, namely 1940. That year, the fall of France within weeks of a German army onslaught meant the loss of Europe's biggest bulwark against militarism, Nazism, Italian fascism in Europe, and of course Japan was making trouble in China and had been for almost a decade by then. This was a stunning turn of events, and it meant that a nightmare geopolitical scenario was at hand. Hostile hegemonic powers were about to unify the rimlands of Western Europe and East Asia, constituting a direct threat to the Americas and the safety that we had enjoyed historically, along with our friends elsewhere in the hemisphere. To avert this tipping point, or perhaps to tip it back, depending on where you think we were in the process, Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, in effect doubling the size of the United States Navy, adding all new capabilities, and giving us enough assets to maintain what amounted to a standalone complete navy on each coast in order to cope with adversaries on those two coasts. And the rest is history. This process, the wisdom of Congress back in 1940 stood us in good stead in that global struggle. I review this episode in brief simply to ask why has Ukraine not had the same sort of galvanic effect on us today? Why have we not acted with the same urgency that the fall of France prompted the decision makers to do back then? Well, I would posit, I would tee up three candidate explanations differentiating between now and then. First of all, Ukraine has not fallen. If France had stood for a while or only partially succumbed to the German offensive back in 1940, much as it did in 1914, the signal to Washington that we needed to get ready, that a tipping point was at hand, and that we needed to take matters into our own hands would have been much weaker. Secondly, I would propose that we may not like Vladimir Putin. I know I don't, but he's no Hitler. He would love to break NATO. He makes no bones about that. But at the same time, he does not seem to have the designs on conquering the entire Western European rimland or helping China do the same thing in the Far East. So this too, I think, modulates the deterrent signal and keeps down the political reaction or a counter reaction here in the United States and in allied capitals. And lastly, China, as we turn our attention to the Far East, China prefers to operate in the gray zone. And it does so precisely to hold down the amplitude of that danger signal to Washington and other capitals that oppose it. It likes to do things by increments. That's the point of its South China Sea strategy. It would like to subdue Taiwan without a fight. perhaps by just frightening it into submission, imposing economic pressure, or doing other things short of actually going to open war, and so forth. But again, China, I think, grasped the logic of the tipping point, and it would like to speed its way to an orderly change of state in the Far East without actually going to open war. So bottom line, as it turns out, both we and our allies and our friends and our opponents get a say in whether and how we pass the tipping point in Eurasia, and whether any changes brought about by that tipping point will actually stand. Because we do get a say in this. We do have a chance to shape our own destiny, provided we realize what the situation is and what our options are.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that very much. Now that we have the context and strategic oversight, and I will make sure that we save time for questions, but I thought I'd return to to the discussion about deterrence and what are the capabilities and or approaches that the U.S. needs to focus on that will effectively deter the Chinese and or, if deterrence fails, deny them their strategic objectives. Becca, you really touched on it, so I thought I'd start with you.
Yeah, thanks. That's such a good question. And it's also an opportunity for me to flog a recent report that I just published called Campaign of Denial, which is looking at how the United States can better deter during peacetime. The current administration has put forward this idea of campaigning in the U.S. National Defense Strategy, but they don't really define campaigning terribly well. And so part of what I wanted to do was to think about how campaigning links to deterrence. And there it actually was sort of pulling the follow through of linking campaigning, or what it is you do during peacetime, to warfighting concepts. So this means that the choices that you make about your forces, where you posture them, what capabilities they have with them, when you want them to be in theater, right? When it is you want them to be out of garrison in the United States and forward in, the Indo-Pacific or in threatened territory or near threatened territory, right? It's all of these choices actually need to be linked to the idea of warfighting. And by doing so, you actually find yourself strengthening deterrence and strengthening your ability to deny a potential adversary their objective. So with that, it really means that that the United States needs to think how it could alter its existing forces and capabilities, its posture and its activities by linking them to warfighting. It means really transforming some of the theater forces to make sure that they are better linked to being able to execute warfighting concepts. It means having forces that have the requisite skill set and the requisite capability, and that those capabilities are within range of their potential targets should they be needed. All of this is not intended to, turn up the heat in the Indo-Pacific if we're thinking of it in the context of deterring China, right? It's not intended to undermine stability, but rather that if these changes are made and they're done incrementally, and you're not doing this whole cloth, but rather trying to show little bits and pieces of what you could bring to bear in a potential high-end fight, that's the way in which you can start to strengthen deterrence, at least in the near term, with existing forces and resources at hand as we wait for some of those modernization priorities to come online. To me, that's sort of the theory of the case of what we can do now that's going to bring us through almost this interregnum as we wait for force modernization to bear fruit.
So, thank you. Appreciate that. I was going to add some of the questions that we both spent quite a bit of time out in Indo-Pacific Command, and that is such a key point. There's a gap here, a posture gap, a capability gap that we have to find a way and alternate approaches, capabilities that we can mitigate any of the challenges in the near term in order to get to that far term capability that we talk about. So thanks for that, Becca. General Robling?
Yeah,
Sir?
I think that's a great point, Becca. I mean, I think if you look at our laydown right now, I mean, USARPAC in Hawaii has 1 brigade. They've got some Army forces deployed out in Japan. The Marine Corps has, a MEF, but it's a MEF light. It's a division light and an air wing, and the normal MAGTAP that the Marines bring, and of course the Navy has some of their ships. I think the PACOM commander has about 100 of the 300 of the Navy ships that we have, and he musters some of those all of the time. But we have to do things like freedom of navigation, sorties between Taiwan and China, those types of things. Every once in a while, we fly B-1s out to Guam and then use them for show of force in Korea and those kind of things. And of course, the Marines are forward deployed with F-35s in Iwakuni, Japan, and we have F-22s in Hawaii and F-22s in Alaska that can be there within 24 hours. And then moving those forces up and back every once in a while as a posture does make deterrence help. But I think there's other things that we can look at, quantum computing, those kind of things that would tend to deter a force from starting out right away, especially if we didn't have the unambiguous warning or ambiguous warning that we think that we might want to have.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Holmes?
Yeah, thanks. I like to start with the theory of deterrence whenever I get into these discussions, and my favorite one comes from Henry Kissinger from all the way back in the '60s, and he defines deterrence in sort of the standard way. It's a product of capabilities and intentions and skill, competence at using your capabilities to do what you say you're going to do, which is to follow through on the threat. But I like his the best simply because he adds in another variable, the variable of belief. You have to make your adversary a believer in your capability, your intentions to follow through on your threats. And I think there's a political dimension, a diplomatic dimension to that we should not overlook as we try to build forces, as we make ourselves competent at doing the things that we are trying to do. So I think that's sort of the North Star to me. As far as a little bit more specific things that we should need to be doing. If anybody's interested in the gray zone operations in particular, I would call your attention to what we call the Maritime Counterinsurgency Project down at the Naval Institute Proceedings, which has been ongoing for about a year now. Seems like we started in July of last year. I led off with an article called "You Have to Be There," making the very simple point that we are not on the scene in the South China Sea and other gray zone contests. We can't really do a whole lot. We show up, we do our exercises, and we go away. And guess who's left holding the territory after the U.S. Navy and the Joint Force go away? Yeah, it falls back into the hands of the China Coast Guard, the Maritime Militia, PLA Navy, and all the joint forces that support that. We have to figure out ways to get closer to scenes of action with relevant platforms in order to mount any type of deterrence in support of the Philippines or Vietnam or whoever happens to be under duress. In the warfighting realm, I think sort of two things. First of all, we need to say, and Becca referred to this, we need to say no to a short war in the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, East China Sea, wherever the case of the fight may be. Mike Gallagher, representative out of Wisconsin, who chairs the China Committee in the House, is fond of saying that if it's a short war, China is going to win. And I think he's right. I think it's almost impossible to imagine a case in which we are the stronger contender on day one of a conflict. Which I think this insight is what gives rise to a lot of the talk we've heard over the last decade, really since the 2015 timeframe, about distributed maritime operations, about expeditionary advanced base operations. We are talking about dispersing our combat power into lots of elusive but hard-hitting packets, spreading out along the first island chain, and basically doing what the Marines call making ourselves a stand-in force that will not be driven out of the region. If we can convey to China that we can do that, and we can actually frustrate their aims, we can balk their strategy on day one of a conflict and stretch things out and make things very, very difficult for them. I think that turns into a pretty powerful deterrent signal. As far as platforms, we haven't talked about platforms too much, but we have to get creative. I think it was General Robling or the chair who was talking about China's shipbuilding capacity next to ours. our existing shipyards are fully committed building destroyers and carriers and submarines and whatnot. I can almost look over and see electric boat out of my window here, but there are options. In fact, there's an article in the current issue of Proceedings down at the Naval Institute arguing for that the Navy it really ought to militarize the Coast Guard fast response cutter program. Basically militarize that. He actually did the calculations, figure out you can actually mount naval strike missiles on the stern, and you can multiply your combat power in that sort of small scale dispersed manner, pretty much on the cheap at about $65 million a hull, which is a heck of a lot less than a couple of billion for a destroyer. So just going from the theory to a couple of ideas and all the way down to the nitty gritty, we really have to start thinking about figuring out how to proliferate warships much better than we have. My wife and I went on a cruise up at Bar Harbor for our 35th anniversary back in June, and we went on this nice tour boat, and I looked around, I said, man, why don't we build some of these and put missiles on them?
Could I jump in with a quick two finger? I'm sorry, I know it's a little hard to do this over Zoom, but I think one of the things that Jim is actually hitting on, both with distributed operations and dispersal operations, as well as the idea of presence, it's thinking a little bit more about survivability of platforms and of U.S. posture, right? It's not just enough to be there. It's that you need to be there. You need to be able to withstand a potential attack from China, ride it out, and live to fight again, right? And that's something that is very difficult when you're looking at some of the range issues in the Indo-Pacific. And, that is something that we hear quite a lot when we talk about some of the Navy's large capital ships and their potential role in a, U.S. China fight over Taiwan. So thinking a little bit more about how we can consider survivability of assets to ensure that we have that combat credibility, and therefore that credibility to be either able to either deny China their objectives or be able to, fight them if deterrence were to fail, but also to think a little bit differently about some of our capabilities within this time period, ways in which perhaps maybe the Indo-Pacific provides us with a theater of experimentation in a way that we haven't fully capitalized on. In the Fifth Fleet area of operations, so in the Middle East, there's Task Force 59, which is a smaller funded task force that is trying to do more with existing, autonomous systems. These are capabilities that are already in existence. They're just not fielded to scale, and trying to incorporate those into peacetime deterrence activities, such as monitoring of large sea space, exercises and whatnot. And this is something that we could look into doing more of in the Indo-Pacific, with a way that starts allowing us to think about trying to make sure that our manned assets or our crewed assets, whether that's air, space, ground, are a little bit more survivable and postured to be survivable. And the ways in which we can maybe use some of these uncrewed systems, these autonomous systems, to help still be present and push in firepower as needed while still enhancing overall joint force survivability.
Thanks, Becca. Appreciate that.
Let me just pile on to that a little bit, because there are things that we are doing now, Becca. I mean, like Dr. Holmes talked about the stand-in force, and the former commandant took a lot of heat for reorganizing the Marines specifically to be that stand-in force. And so we're buying, naval strike missiles and Tafir missiles and medium-range missiles. And there's ways that you can, shoot, be detected, hand off, let another radar do the final end game while you're maneuvering out of harm's way. So there's little things that you can do. And on the autonomous side, I agree, we need to get it to scale. And right now, I think all of the plans from now to probably 2030 is the plan to develop those. And we know that Xi said he wanted the PLA forces to be able to take Taiwan by 2027. So that may be a little bit late, I don't know.
Thanks to you all. Do we have time still for a few questions? Okay. Questions from the audience? See one way in the back.
This is for Dr. Holmes. Sir, Mark Castellucci, Connecticut Army National Guard. You probably don't remember, but in 2019, you helped me write an essay about freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea entitled, "Whose Lane Is It Anyway?" In which I posited and argued in favor of freedom of navigation operations due to their ability to strengthen the U.S. position in the global world order. Lots changed since then, and I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts on freedom of navigation operations today, especially since they could potentially be a tipping point in the 21st century Thucydides trap, or even perhaps a tool to manage the geopolitical strategic environment vis-a-vis China and or Russia. Thank you. Good to see you, sir.
I actually do remember, Chris. So yeah, I'm glad to see you. I can only see the back of your head, so I guess I wouldn't have recognized you anyway. But yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think there's a dangerous, and you still hear this from time to time. Is that you don't hear it so much anymore, but for a long time we thought that FONOPs, or freedom of navigation operations, were somehow a deterrent to what China was doing in the gray zone. And I don't think they're a deterrent at all. I think they are vitally important. I mean, what we are seeing in our lifetimes is the renewal of a very old argument that we thought had been settled back in the 17th century between advocates of freedom of navigation, freedom of the sea, who argue that no coastal state essentially can own the sea, can make the sea a sovereign expanse. And then the countries such as England back in those days that said, yes, we can own the sea. That's literally the title of John Selden's book on the closed sea. Whereas Grotius, arguing on behalf of the Dutch Empire, argued for freedom of the seas as we know it. We thought that argument had been settled back in the 1980s with the Law of the Sea Treaty, but apparently it has not, because China has chosen to renew it. Russia also in the Arctic has done some things that look like Chinese gray zone operations to a lesser extent. But I mean, so as a legal matter, yes, you have to do that. You have to, if you do not challenge excessive maritime claims of various types, ultimately it looks like you are consenting to those, and consent, what states do, is a valid source of international law. So it behooves us and our partners. I think we've done a good job, especially in the recent years, of doing this. But again, as far as deterring China from doing things in the gray zone, once again, what do you do during a freedom of navigation operation? You cruise by, you defy the unlawful claim, and you go away. And again, that doesn't really do much to face down the Chinese maritime militia, the China Coast Guard, and so forth. You really do have to figure out how to build essentially an escalation ladder. Right now in the gray zone, our only real options are do nothing, shoot, or nuke them. And that's not really a very good palette of options. Whereas China has lots of escalatory options between the maritime militia, the Coast Guard, the Navy, all these assets that it has in the region. So in a sense, that's why we need to work with our regional partners to get U.S. and allied assets out there to support those beleaguered countries. So I guess my overall point is FONOPs are necessary, but far from sufficient for us to accomplish our goals in the region.
Thank you. Time for one more question? Yes, sir.
Hello.
Oh.
Nick Cato, the paparazzi again. So a lot of the conversation around Ukraine and Russia and China, Taiwan is that we need to support Ukraine so that way when states attack smaller states, then there's some kind of consequence. Well, assuming that the United States and Western allies continue to support Ukraine and they reach some form of détente with Russia, what's to stop China from going after Taiwan anyways when there's already some political wavering and the West has expelled all this political capital and treasure and time and everything, basically becoming a more weakened adversary?
Well, that's the issue. I mean, Senator Blumenthal put it pretty clearly that he believes that, we have to show a strong hand, and a strong hand says we support, we're behind those people that we have treaties and allies with. And of course, the Taiwan Relations Act is strategic ambiguity. I mean, it doesn't say we'll come and save you, and it also says we will when we need to. So, and of course, the president just recently said, yes, we'll defend Taiwan if they come after them. So I think that's still pretty ambiguous, yeah. I don't know.
Becca,
Dr. Holmes?
anything to add?
No, I mean, I think you covered it really well. I think in some ways, if I can just sort of go on a little bit of a tangent here, I think there are two things that are worth kind of noting about the linkage that folks seem to be making and the Biden administration seems to be making between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, if you will. So one is, is strengthening belief that the United States and other like-minded nations would support in some way. And so what effect might that have on the deterrent calculus? To me, that's not entirely clear to sort of the skepticism that I think I heard in the question. But what it does do, and U.S. and European and other nations continuing to support Ukraine, it does impact how Ukraine is able to potentially prosecute its fight, but also its own will to fight. And so having that signal, I think, is very important to Taiwan, who obviously they would be the frontline defenders in case of any type of potential incursion, not just a full-blown invasion, but to some of those gray zone scenarios that Jim was referring to as well. I think the other thing that we sometimes get a little bit tortured about is that some of the U.S. support to Ukraine is coming at the expense of potential support to Taiwan. In my analysis, which has looked at, what is needed for a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific and what is needed for a potential conflict in Europe, the two are not the same. Of course, there are some, commonalities, and these are these high demand, low density assets that are required all around the world, air defense, tankers, you name it. But when you actually look at some of the requirements for prosecuting these fights in different theaters, the emphasis is different because while they are still these sort of all domain operations, if you will, there is an different emphasis on domains, and because of differences in geography, there are just different requirements for forces and capabilities. So all of that to say is, I think if you put all of that in total, there are some positive signals in what the United States is doing, not just about whether its actions vis-a-vis Ukraine are having a deterrent effect on China or not.
Thanks, Becca. We could go on and talk for another hour, but I think it's time to get ready for our final panel and probably have a good stretch. Maybe a stand up and stretch.
A stand up and stretch in place event here. Here we go. Yet another audible.
Thank you to our
just a stretch.
panelists.